Welcome back, AP. So I've been banished down to my dad's basement, where he works on a lot of stuff, including instruments and whatnot. So we're just gonna make do because my wife was getting mad because we were using the same workspace, and she was tired of hearing me talk about the agricultural revolution, the cottage industry, and the putting out system. All right. So speaking of those things, quick retract or like quick thing. All right. So in your agricultural revolution, the legacy of the open field system slide, make sure you circle the word fallow, all right? Fallow. That word that actually means when a field is let to sit and just kind of rest for a year, which was really stupid and led to a 30% decrease in crop potential outputs, right? So, and then when it said like other techniques on the board, right? Make sure you just jot down like, oh, the use of turnips. The growing of another thing called clover was a really big one. And then if you grew clover, it actually was like on top of the soil. And when the animals, the livestock would actually come around to feed off of that, their manure would help fertilize the soil and stuff like that. So the agricultural revolution was a really big deal because it actually led to a gigantic increase in agricultural output in a very short amount of time and with not a huge increase in work needed. All right. So like the agricultural revolution, though, is huge. Cottage industry is huge. Make sure you circle that word. The putting out system is huge. Make sure you circle that word. And how we talked about the industrious revolution. Make sure you circle that word. Talking about how people are now beginning to make money, even in the wintertime. All right. So now, anyway, but now when we're looking at this whole thing, you're thinking to yourself, well, what's going on in the cities? Well, who's making money there? Well, that's the thing, is your urban sector is beginning to die off a little bit, right? So hence the death. Oh god, the cottage industry, the putting out system, the industrious revolution, they were like the final death toll of the urban guild, right? So guilds, remember guilds? Like, yeah, guilds, good stuff. All right, so like guilds back in the day, we talked about the Renaissance, merchant and craft guilds, how merchant guilds grew way faster because they're like the new trade routes were being used and things like that. Yeah, right. So here's the thing. The rural industries are now undermining them. All right, so for just reason. All right, like I mean, they caused like the stagnation of the economics in Europe for like years, right? So because guilds had always been about three big things, right? The community aspect of setting prices, making money, and doing their best to create a monopoly on a product, right? So the thing about these three things is the only one that's advantageous to a capitalist system is the making money aspect. Setting prices and creating monopolies is a very difficult thing that actually causes market stagnation, all right? So it makes it so people aren't making money in huge sweeps anymore. Now, this next thing where I'm going to put, for example, do not write this down. There is only one part on this slide you need to write down. It is symbolized by a star or an asterisk, all right? So, for example, though, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, remember that guy, right? Louis XIV, or this, wait, crap. This guy, this guy. All right. So yeah, actually, yeah, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, right? Louis XIV's financial advisor, hero of mercantilism, encouraged guilds to help stimulate the economy of France and to collect taxes, right? Well, here's the thing. He's operating in the early 70s because Louis died in 1714, so he's operating really as chief. Perspectives are in the late 1600s, you know, coming out the heels of the 30 Years' War, probably thinking to himself, let's stimulate this economy a little bit. Let's get the guilds going. Under him, the number of guilds in Paris grew in 1672 from 60 to 129 of them in 1691. You're looking at a 100% rate of increase, right? So, well, the thing about it, now this is what you need. The star next to it, write this down. Guilds had pre-existing rights to set prices, hire workers, train apprentices, and access to raw materials that were being brought in by state-owned vessels. Well, here's the thing. Things have changed since then, right? Since the 1690s, or right around the 1690s, with colonial growth and the products coming in from different vendors like the British East India Company, your different like merchant, actual like self-sustaining companies that are bringing these raw materials in for the colonies, guilds are going to start getting forced out, right? Because they are expensive. They are very expensive. They restrict workers of women. They restrict Jews, foreigners, etc. They're extremely exclusive, right? So they're not good for an economy in this sense. They're not good for that global market that Europe is growing into. Guilds are eventually going to be dissolved in 1791 in France because they are seen as a hindrance to the economy, right? And this is right on the doorstep, right on the doorstep. Write that down somewhere. On the doorstep of the Industrial Revolution, right? So when the Industrial Revolution hits, now all these people that have been forced out from enclosure systems and stuff like that will now be able to find work in places like factories. Well, see, here's the thing in the long run, your guilds just kind of turned into factory owners. I mean, like, that's just kind of all that happened. They didn't really go anywhere. They just changed face, okay? So, and many countries are going to follow. Many believe that these things slowed economies, technology, and even slowed political advancement, right? So, the death rattle of the urban guild, right? So now the banishments of guilds, though, is going to give way to the ideas of economic liberalism, right? Which, of course, is championed by your guy, the economics man, Adam Smith, right? Now, what we mean by economic liberalism is not liberalism in the modern day political sense. We mean the idea that free trade and competition would benefit all people, rich and poor. All right, so now some of y'all are like, well, how's that liberal? Because the conservatives today, we think in free the markets, don't regulate anything. My dad popped up behind me right now. He'd probably be pretty pissed off. But so anyway, now the reason why it's called liberalism at the time is because under mercantilism, everything was state-sponsored, right? Your monarchs are trying to grow their wealth as fast as possible by imposing impositions, taxes, tonnage, poundage, and actually regulating the economy to grow their cash wealth, right? So economic liberalism, the change of the idea is monarch, stay out of it. You will make your money on the back end from taxation. You do not need to enforce state regulations, right? So according to Smith, trade must remain free, all right? Trade must remain free and competitive, not hindered by the government, which the only thing the government should be around to do is provide the defense, sponsor public works, serve judiciously and strongly against mercantilism, right? Adam Smith, it goes mercantilism, Adam Smith's economic liberalism. Bang! Complete opposites, right? Mercantilism was a great idea when you just discovered the colonies. But now, when they're self-sustaining and their output is growing, and when you can take these agricultural revolutionary ideas and then ship them over to the colonies, and now you can begin to afford things like coffee, sugar, chocolate. When you can actually afford all these things, economic liberalism seems like the better option, right? So guilds are going to persist in many countries well into the future, blah, 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 like in Germany, where they're like, oh, hey, die ganze Zeit. So now the thing about it, though, is that they're not going to be able to compete with the division of labor and the growing consumer market of the Industrious Revolution, right? So funny I say division of labor, all right? So division of labor is something that goes directly in the face of Adam Smith, all right? So Adam Smith didn't see certain things coming. He did not see things coming like wage stagnation. He actually advocated for the increasing of wages. He hates the division of labor because he thinks it keeps poor people stupid and more like automatons, more robotic than it does actually learning a craft and learning a skill, right? You only learn one skill. Spinsters only spin. Weavers only weave. Carders only card. There's a good joke in here somewhere. I just can't think of it. All right, so now he actually said in one of his quotes, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable, right? So that actually is not something he advocated for. True capitalism actually doesn't like division of labor, and it actually advocates for proper wage increases based on the work allotted, right? Well, now we got to get into the global economy, right? This is the last phase of the stuff we're talking about. How the economy went from this little nugget thing inside of Europe to being this gigantic global commerce market. And this right here is where Europe puts the stake in the ground and is like, this is us now, baby. We got it. We own it. We're drawing the maps. Let's go. All right. So where does Smith go in all this? Well, Adam Smith said that the two most important discoveries that were ever made were the Americas and the Cape of Good Hope, right? So because you could access now different spheres of an economy. Right? A transatlantic, trans-Pacific, trans-Indian Ocean economy, right? So Spain and Portugal, of course, in the 15s and 1600s under Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Columbus, Pizarro, Cortez, all those guys are going to be boosting their economies from about 15s to 1600s. But we all know what happened when Spain's silver showed up and when the Dutch met the Portuguese in India. All right, so the 1700s changed it all. Spain and the Portuguese kind of fanned out into the sides, right? Spain was worried about like going into Northern California and spreading Catholicism and stuff, which is good. It's a good thing. But like it's not economically as big, right? Now, Great Britain is going to pop up in 1707, okay? That's right. We're finally in Great Britain phase because Queen Anne actually united the Scotland and England back together again, all right? So following the English Civil War and stuff like that. The Netherlands, the Dutch, right? And France, right? The French, of course, the French. All right, so now, anyway, getting into it, though, let's talk about colonial wars and mercantilism, right? Now, so when you're looking at, mercantilism, it's basic math. It is basic math. That all of these things of mercantilism and growing global economies are going to lead to war in some facet or another, right? Speaking of basic math, let's go ahead and move my face real quick. Move me down here. Here goes basic history math. Boats that give you lots of money plus really pissed off monarch equals war every single time, all right? So mercantilism was actually giving a giant reserve chest of, what are we doing now? What are we doing? Okay, let's slide me over. There we go. All right, so what mercantilism was doing was giving a giant reserve for any time a monarch felt a violent fit of rage, he could wage war, right? And a lot of these things were set up by things like the Navigation Acts, right? The Navigation Acts actually set a lot of these colonial wars into progress, right? Because they're mercantile acts, right? Mercantile acts in the sense they created a shipping monopoly on goods coming and going to the 13 colonies of Britain, right? The Navigation Acts ushered in by Cromwell and the Commonwealth said that all goods from the 13 British colonies must be transported on British vessels. And if they're being transported on British vessels that are going into Britain, that means that they have a monopoly on processed goods going back to the colonies that the colonies can now only buy, right? So it actually started a lot of problems due to the fact that the Dutch were like, get out of our market. You know what I mean? Like, you got to get out of here. This is insane, okay? So war is going to break out 3 different times, all right? So specifically between the Dutch and the British, all right? So the Dutch and the British are going to go through the Anglo-Dutch Wars of 1651 to 1674, where basically it's going to be this big jockeying back and forth, because who did I say were the big dogs in the 1700s? Great Britain, France, the Dutch, right? So the French and they're going to decide we're going to support the Dutch today, and then tomorrow we'll support the British, and blah, blah, blah. So it was like a 3-way war. Now the thing about it is the one big outcome of the Anglo-Dutch Wars was that the Dutch and their ability to wage war was significantly impacted. They were still making lots of money, but they also lost a lot of their colonial reserves. New Amsterdam became New York, right? So and that lost that to the English. It damaged their ability to wage war, and it hurt their trade tremendously, right? So they began to pivot, and they kind of just focused on other aspects. Tulip mania, civets cats, stuff like that. All right, now, so the Dutch are going to be kind of knocked out of the game in the late 1600s when it comes to waging colonial war, right? But then who's left? But your 2 big dogs, France and Britain, right? So we got to weigh them in, though. So France and Britain are the 2 big rivals when it comes to colonial warfare and rivalries, right? These wars are like 3 rounds of a boxing match. Somebody I know for a fact, Emily O'Donnell right now is like, I thought you said there were 3 wars a second ago. Well, there was, okay? That was like your early fight card, you know what I mean? Like the warm-up fights before the main event. The main event was a 3-round boxing match. And we'll talk about boxing later on and how funny this little joke will actually get later. From 1701 to 1706. That makes no sense. Those years are wrong. I'll fix those later. Just don't write the years. 3 boxing rounds between France and Great Britain. Of course, France, Great Britain. Stereotypes. We love them. All right, so now, anyway, the thing about it is, round 1 was the War of Spanish Succession. We have talked about this already. That was when Louis XIV tried to inherit the throne of Spain from his grandson, Philip IV, right? And he was like, I want your colonies, I want your throne, I want all this stuff, and I want to make a giant European state of France and Spain that will dominate all, right? And then Europe basically, under the trumpet of Great Britain, was like, we can't let him have all these colonies, we can't let him have all this stuff, so let's unite together and smack Louis in the mouth. And they did, and they won, right? And at the Peace of Utrecht, he had to back off, all right? So, anyway, Then you had round two, which was the War of Austrian Succession, which was like a flare-up and lasted for like 2 seconds. Because Frederick the Great, right, the enlightened despot that he was, he sees this place called Silesia, right? Silesia was a very, very wealthy area of native German-speaking people. But here's the problem. Prussians and Austrians both speak German, right? So Silesia was actually owned by the Austrians for quite some time. And Maria Theresia is going to pop up, and she's like, no, that's mine. You don't get that. Gimme, right? Because at the time when he actually stripped this land from them, there was no real Austrian leader because Maximilian was her husband, Maria Theresia's, and he was ruling over the HRE, and like the HRE is kind of like a collapsing like a souffle you took out of the oven and like too fast, right? So, and Maria Theresa is going to try and claim it back. They go to war. Frederick the Great ends up retaining it, and he sits on it, right? So, but the big one, round three, all right, the 7 Years' War. The war that you know of most often as the French and Indian War, right? So now the thing about it is this is your third round. Fatality is on the way, all right? So it is an inconclusive war in Europe, just to give you a heads up. So in Europe, there was infighting between two major factions of like France, Saxony, Austria, Russia, as well as a couple of other smaller states, versus Great Britain, Prussia, and then Hanover, which was another wealthy province in Europe inside the HRE. Now, the thing about it was inconclusive in in Europe due to the fact that there were skirmishes in Europe, but Frederick the Great and Austria and Prussia were really just still fighting over that little dinky Silesia, and of course Prussians are going to end up keeping it no matter what and grew their boundaries. And then Maria Theresia tries to fight for it back, but doesn't ever quite get it because, like, the Habsburg economy is kind of floundering at this point. And then going forward, though, from 1754 to about 1763, everything changed. So the reason being is because France actually, there was no direct line. All right, let's roll it back real quick. So you see this big green right here? All that green is the reason why the French and Indian War lasted. Is because there was no geographic border between the English 13 colony holdings and the Canadian region of France, right? So the area of New France is what it was called, centered around Quebec, right? There was no geographic boundary between those two. So the French began to set up trade forts and things like that, like Fort Necessity. Of course, I think Fort Necessity is around here somewhere. But yeah, right here. Fort Necessity is right there. And that's where George Washington was actually captured. He actually fought in this war alongside of the Brits. So now, since there's no geographic boundary and small skirmishes break out, it is going to turn into a big issue because it was 55,000 French people in the colonies versus 1.2 million people inside of the British colonies. The French never really grew their numbers in the colonies very much at all, due to the fact that it was very cold, the planting situations are not really ideal, and then also they were there for one big reason, fur trapping, right? They wanted muskrats and beavers and stuff like that. So France, Russia, Austria, Saxony, Sweden, and Native Americans, some Native Americans allied with the Brits as well, but you were more likely to ally with the French because the French did not really try to strip land or impose their ideas upon the natives particularly because there wasn't a lot of them, right? There wasn't that many French people there. Whereas the Brits were much more like, you're not really using this land, so I'm going to take it, which is a big deal. Now, versus Britain, Prussia, and Hanover. Now, in 1763, the whole game was changed when Montcalm and Wolfe were going against each other, and John Wolfe dies and then is replaced by William Pitt, right? Pittsburgh William Pitt, right? And he's going to change it. And he's going to lead a naval and land assault that wins the war for Britain, right? And in 1763, the Treaty of Paris is signed. France loses all of its North American holdings and most of India, all right? So, but here's the thing. They weren't that worried about it, all right? Because it was a massive British victory after a huge naval and land raid by William Pitt, which was the replacement of James Wolfe, the guy who died in the famous, Death of Wolfe painting. You'll see it in a second, right? France was really actually protecting its real cash cow, right? They weren't making a ton of money off the fur and trapping anyway. Those were private companies that were there making a lot of money off that. France was only concerned with retaining one place, Haiti. If they can hold on to Haiti, Saint-Domingue, that means that they could literally just wreck house in Europe because they're making all the coffee and sugar the world needs, right? The first true world war was the French and Indian War. This fighting broke out in India, Africa, North America, Europe, and the Caribbean, all over the place, right? Now, disease also, another really cool fact about the French and Indian War, disease killed 5 times as many people as combat did. All right, so you had a lot of problems in the Caribbean with malaria, yellow fever. I feel like I've said malaria and yellow fever like 6 times in these couple flips. And this, of course, being the famous painting of the death of Tom Wolfe at the Battle of Quebec, right? So, as you can see right here, these are British soldiers, and there is an Iroquois native that is actually allied with them. So, the funny thing about it is, it all broke out, too, in other areas. Like, some of you are like, why is it breaking out in India and Africa? What's over there? That's not... Well, it broke out in India and Africa over, like, certain trade items, right? So, for example, India was the world's cheap producer of cotton at the time, and then in Africa on the Senegalese coast, there was this stuff called gum arabic, which the French really, really wanted, and so did the Brits, because it made gelatinous materials. It was a binder, a chemical binder that could make candies, it could make cleaners, it could make all kinds of stuff, but it just made it viscous, right? So, it's actually the sap from a plant, right? So, now, all this economic shifting. So, but basically what happens is, like, Britain just goes, cock, cock, boom, and knocks out France. And all this economic shifting and European dominance is brought to you by not viewers like you. Unfortunately, Arthur did not deliver Britain's dominance over, like, intercoastal trade and the growth of their empire. It was actually brought to you by trade. All right, so, and it's also not this trade. This is how we teach the intercoastal global economic trade functions of Europe to like 4th graders. It's triangular, and look, the raw materials and the processed stuff and the slaves from Africa, right? So it actually looked a heck of a lot more like this. Different trade routes all over the places, different products moving different directions. It was a global economy. Global, absolutely global economy, okay? Now, going forward, though, sponsored not only by countries, but also private organizations, right? So Europe is going to literally become the world power dominant. Even though they're fighting with each other, they knew what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the control of this new global market that nowhere else in the world was prepared technologically or militarily to pick up and defend, right? So these big companies that are also going to get involved, though, are your British East India Company and your Dutch East India Company. That's being your British, this being your Dutch. And then that's your Dutch West Indies Company, which actually, like, their big shtick was stealing from the Spanish. But, like, that's a whole different story. Now, we got 2 more slides, and then we're done, okay? Now, Europe, though, particularly Great Britain, following these colonial wars, are making tons of money off colonial goods. And the crazy part about it is they're then using another brand new market they've created, right? If they're taking all these raw materials from the colonies, processing them, and then flipping them, right? Then they're selling it back to the colonies at an increased rate. Like, so genius, right? France stayed prosperous as well, even though Britain was basically wrecking house in the entire world, killing it, growing their navy, kind of just like glaring at the Dutch from across the channel, being like, what's up? Like, now, France is going to stay prosperous, though, because of Haiti, because of coffee and sugar, Martinique, which is going to give them fishing rights, as well as Guadeloupe, right? So they did stay prosperous, but they were never like the financial wrecking crew that Britain was, right? So Spain is going to start recovering slowly after all these economic global intercedes. They stable their silver mining. They create this thing called debt peonage, which is basically where they kind of got rid of the encomienda system because it was killing all the natives, right? So they actually used indentured debt slavery of the natives. So they would actually give them like a home, tools, a little bit of funding, right? And then they would actually jack up the interest rates on it, making it so they could never actually get out from their debt. They also gained the Louisiana Territory from the French when they actually lost the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, when we talk about that. Spanish society is also going to expand. It's going to be the big attempt at trying to hold on to what they were losing, right? So wealthy people that were born in the colonies, they create a new class of planters called Creoles, right? They are going to try and convert the natives to Catholicism, as well as some of the slaves as well. And then there's going to be a massive amount of racial mixing, which we have talked about before, with the mestizos and the mulattoes and things like that in these Spanish areas. But then what do you do when a mestizo and a mulatto have a baby, right? Like, so we talked about that, okay? Now, the other big thing is the Atlantic slave trade is going to boom from about the 1490s to about 1807, right? So following these colonial wars in the mid-1700s, or 1700s to the 1800s, it was stimulated by the rise of plantation economics, okay, to provide raw materials for the growth of manufacturing rates in Europe. After the agricultural revolution and when the cottage industry boomed and then the putting out system started, you're seeing where this is now coming around full circle, right? We're now coming all the way back to where we started these flips, right? Stimulated by the rise of plantation economies, providing the raw materials so these people in these new cottage industries could process these goods. That stimulated the plantation economics that you know of when you think of slavery in North America, right? Now, 50% of all the slaves were traded between the years of 1701 and 1800. So you can see after the agricultural revolution and the growth of manufacturing in Europe, slavery was boomed, right? Absolutely boomed. 12.5 million, this is an estimate, slaves survived the transition into the North and South Americas, right? Roughly 2 million of them, though, died en route, which is awful. 45, this is a crazy little statistic, though, too, because in the minds of a lot of walking around American kids, most of those slaves ended up here, which is actually not true. 45% of them ended up in Brazil, 45% ended up in the Caribbean, about 3% in North America, like in the 13 colonies, and then 7% is everywhere else, right? So now this was a really crazy thing, too. The fort versus shore slave trade, all right? So they started realizing as time was going on in this globalized economy, trying to pay French forts to let English ships dock there and pick up slaves was a huge issue, right? Trying to prevent other small wars from breaking out between people like your British East India Company and French maritime guilds, right? They decided instead to just pull up next to the shore and talk to local African leaders, right? So local Africans were actually trading processed goods and guns on the shores of Africa to British slave traders, right? So and that's where they got most of them. This dialogue of these people walking into Africa and grabbing people up and then walking out with them is very, very, very rare, extremely rare. Now, the abolition movement, though, because of all of these things, is going to grow in Great Britain, and the slave trade is going to be abolished in 1807. All right, so last thing, trade in Asia and the Pacific, right? So there we go. Fighting over the Indian Ocean market had been raging since the 1500s, right? The Portuguese were there first, and they actually worked with Indian princes of the Mughal Empire, but then the Dutch actually made a port over in Java, and then they actually forced out the Portuguese, beat them up, and then put the Indians under their control, so basically threatened the Indians as well. And then the Brits came in after the Anglo-Dutch Wars and then forced them out, right? So India was the big, big grappling area. Now, the Mughal Empire were the people that actually ruled over India going into the 1800s. And they actually were used deliberately by the Brits and the French until 1805, right? Because the Brits are going to take over completely under this guy named Robert Clive. And what I mean is used by, so it was basically let's say my classroom is India, right? And you were all Mughal princes, and Keo was trying to take some land from me and in my classroom, right? So he knows that Grace, being a Mughal princess, and then over across the classroom, Danielle being another Mughal princess, they don't like each other. So he would go up to Grace and be like, "Look, I'll give you guns and stuff if you go fight her." All right, so thinking that if his side wins, he reaps the benefits and he gets trade agreements in Grace's area of India in this Mughal Empire, right? Well, I'm going to back Danielle because I want her to win this fight so I can actually win it, right? So literally the British and the French fought over India without ever even being there physically as much, right? So, but the Brits are going to take over completely when the French get almost completely forced out, right? So James Cook also is going to explore and colonize Africa. Not Africa. That's not supposed to say Africa. That's supposed to say Australia. I'm sorry about that. So right, Australia right there, Polynesia, the Cook Islands, and he also dies later in Hawaii. So Asia and the Pacific are going to be brought into this global economy, and everything's just a booming, right? So and that's it. That's your break flip material, right? So I'll send out those emails about those quizzes and stuff like that, and I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a good one.